Hi, and welcome everyone to Auntie Midori's Office Hour. And today we have a special guest and gonna tackle a big topic, not the usual. So buckle up that seatbelt and polish off your brain, shake out the dust from your nerve endings. Welcome, Caroline Carrington.
Good morning, Midori. I'm really grateful to be here. And normally when I'm doing videos like this, I am speaking in my role as a Neo-Tantra teacher, helping people get out of their heads and into their bodies through dynamic meditation. And I love doing that. And today we're talking about something that's both deeply personal and I also think really relevant to what is happening in the US today. As I get started, I want to just begin by saying it's actually part of why I'm wearing black today, but I want to honor all the people who lost their lives in the struggle for freedom and democracy for everybody in South Africa. And I also want to be very clear that I am not apologizing for any of the atrocities or the institutionalized racism that were literally written into the Constitution under the apartheid regime. It's quite edgy for me to talk about this, and for those of you who know me, I tend to like to talk about things I'm an expert on. But part of why I'm offering this is to address some of my privilege as a white person growing up in South Africa, and to, the word atone comes to mind, but like to do what I can to make right and to help us learn a little from the lessons of apartheid. And I had people starting to ask me more and more regularly. I mean, I've had it my whole life, but about what South Africa was like growing up in apartheid. But it came, or at least they'll ask what it was like growing up in South Africa. But most people tend to associate South Africa with two things, with the system of apartheid and perhaps not in America, but with Bafana, our soccer team. So yeah, part of what, when I picked up the phone and I was like, Midori, I want to do this, actually brings it into the present day when the current occupant of the White House was publicly criticizing Nelson Mandela's leadership. And that made me really angry. And I decided to channel that anger into something that could support people in gaining a deeper perspective of not just the news version of what was happening in South Africa, but what it was really like and how that contrasts to what I'm experiencing living in the US today. And for those that might be watching this a little later, I do live in the Bay Area in California. So just to give that frame as well. So I'm going to be speaking mostly about my experience being in California for the last 15 years. I have learned so much, even just in the week leading up to this. And even though I did study political science at university, I'll talk about that in a little while. But while I was studying there, the transition had just happened in South Africa. So, and what I mean by the transition, the democratic election had happened and they had a transitional government where Nelson Mandela was brought into power. We wrote a new constitution, and there was a way of really inviting everybody's voices to the table. So I want to share that just frame that as a young adult, I went to college at 17. I was trying to look at a lot of the solutions that had already been put in place. And in this past week, when I went back to do my research, I was watching literal footage from some of the events that I'll reference. And it once again showed me how privileged I was, because much of this I didn't even see as directly growing up. So it's been quite an awakening for me. So just to give you some context, the beginning of apartheid was formalized in 1948 when the Nationalist Party took power and started implementing the apartheid system. And they did it very, they made it sound, it reminds me a lot of some of the speeches I've heard from Hitler, but they made it sound so normal, like we are different people and we have different cultures, so let's just give us all our own place to learn and be amongst our people and have our culture celebrated. And when it gets started off so gently, it's almost like a frog that's getting thrown in the boiling water. In the water that then gets turned up and the heat cranked up, and you don't really realize the significant rights that are being chipped away at over time. And for me, that feels actually quite relevant, especially to what's been happening in the US, specifically for the last 4 years, but even longer than that. So I was born in Johannesburg, South Africa, at the height of what was called petty apartheid. So grand apartheid was these big laws of segregation where people were sent and families even divided, but they were only allowed to live in certain areas or to work in certain areas. That was more grand apartheid. And they would literally measure like how curly people's hair was. There were all these things written into the law to figure out how you would be classified in South Africa. But petty apartheid was that the buses and the schools and the toilets, for example, were for whites or for non-whites. And I'm using that language specifically because even that, the whole orientation is around whiteness. Speaking with one of my uncles during the past 6 months, I learned that in 1976, now I'm about to age myself, but 2 years before I was born, there was something called the Soweto Uprising. And at the time, my uncle, one of my youngest uncles, was in the army. We had conscription, compulsory conscription. And I remember being in high school, and if you were supposed to stay in high school until 18, but if you chose to leave school early at 16, you were immediately called up to the army. And I know there are other nations in the world, like Israel, for example, where it's also a requirement to do this. But there were so many things happening that were not being explained to the white families that were sending their kids. There was a war in Angola with major atrocities and genocide happening that the South African army was supporting. And, then there were things that were actually just happening in the townships, and the townships were areas created for Black people to live, but in incredibly impoverished situation. Forgive me, I know I'm a little nervous because this is something I'm both passionate about, but I've literally never spoken publicly on this before, so thank you for your patience. So when you fly into Cape Town International Airport, the first 15 or 20 minutes after you leave the airport, driving into Cape Town, which pretty much means everybody who arrives into Cape Town sees rows and rows and rows of squatter camps, of people literally living in corrugated iron. Is that an American word, Midori? Okay, just checking. I speak a few versions of English, but corrugated iron shacks. Some families now are lucky that there's like one tap on each street, and there might be one big light. There's not necessarily electricity to all of these homes. So just to put in context, that is still happening today, and that was definitely happening when I was growing up as a little girl. So jumping back to 2 years before I was born and the Soweto Uprising, my Uncle Martin was in the army, and he was forced to be there. So they then got told, and he was a sniper in the army, he then got told that they were going to go to Soweto, Soweto stands for Southwestern Townships, and it was a township near Johannesburg. And this uprising was mostly children, and literally the way they protested, they were protesting the unjust laws of separate education, where the education that Black and brown people in South Africa could only study in their schools. It was completely segregated. And the education was vastly inferior to those being offered in the white schools. And their form of protest, you can actually watch videos of them toying. That's the very dynamic dancing that people would do. And they would dance in protests. And 700 people were killed that day, like most of them children. And I didn't literally know this until my uncle told me that he and many others in his unit and many of his friends, they actually defaulted. They went AWOL, and they handed in their rifles and said, we so disagree with this, we are not going to do that. But this literally comes right back to my family and how they were involved. So back now to my childhood in Johannesburg, which is now called Gauteng. You can try and pronounce that, Gauteng. We have languages in South Africa that have been influenced by a lot of the colonizers, like the Dutch, and Afrikaans comes from Dutch, so it has these sounds which are quite harsh. But growing up in an English home as a little girl in Johannesburg, it was really quite idyllic. I mean, I remember when the milk would still come in bottles being delivered to the house every day. The milkman would come around. Now I'm really aging myself. Anyway, and we had a full-time live-in nanny and housekeeper. And it wasn't because we were particularly wealthy, or this was just standard. And to have, this is quite a derogatory term, but we called them maids as I was growing up. And even as a student with no money, putting myself through college, as a student when I was 17, we had a maid in our house. There was that much privilege. We would have a maid because we didn't feel like doing our dishes. So that also just speaks to the income disparity that exists in South Africa. And I'm actually still not quite sure where I got it from, but I have quite olive skin. And I grew up in a little beach town called Hout Bay, which was a pretty affluent suburb in Cape Town. And we'd spend a lot of time at the beach. South Africa is quite like Australia. It's very outdoors, or more like Southern California. And one of the ways South Africans cope with things is through humor. And for those of you who know Trevor Noah, he's doing that more and more in America today. So my mom would make a joke saying, when I got really tanned from the sun, she'd say, oh, you have to be reclassified because we're not sure if you're white anymore. And she was joking. And that seemed like an innocent joke at the time. But notice, even in white liberal circles, the racist undertones of apartheid, even with a little girl. So at 10 years old, we're now moved from Johannesburg and we're living in Cape Town. And that's it's 1,200 kilometers away. So it's about like driving to LA there and back. And when I was 10, we got on a ferry and we went to play netball on Robben Island. For those of you who don't know much about South Africa, Robben Island was the prison that Nelson Mandela was in when he was imprisoned for speaking out and protesting and being a political activist against the apartheid regime. And he was there for 27 years. So we go off and we play netball. And he is, you know, at the time, I wasn't tracking. Nelson Mandela is in jail because it had been so long, right? And things were also very edited for us as children. In the schools, our teachers, I remember even all the way up until high school, the history books were very much written in with the stories kind of recrafted and redirected to put white history first. Almost no Black history was taught. And it was all speaking favorably to the perspective of the white person. And I remember, so I've got to work out the year, it was like 95, I think, speaking to my history teacher. And he said, we can't even say anything, even if we personally disagree with what's printed here and what we are required to teach, because we will literally be thrown in jail and lose our jobs, even in a classroom, if we dare to speak up. So again, to make it relevant, right now in California, I think we have a few states of emergency, given the fires and the pandemic. But, you know, normally a state of emergency is declared when things are in such crisis that extra services are needed, and often emergency powers are granted. But in 1984, a state of emergency was declared in South Africa that lasted for 5 years. And the thing that I didn't really realize, thank you so much, Midori, for seeing some of your comments. Firstly, that you're dropping all the links in, but yes, that people don't appreciate my sense of humor. Thank you. Watch more Trevor Noah, and then maybe you will. But on that point, I am noticing that more and more in the US, we're having to make light of the economy, of the state of violence in this country, because it's a means of coping with how bad things are. So, yeah, the state of emergency lasted 5 years. And what that looked like in the white suburbs, we didn't really see much of that. You would see it on the news, but it was kept mostly, the violence was kept mostly in the Black townships. But there were tanks going in, like on a nightly basis. There were frequent raids by the South African police. And I mean, Black people were literally living in a war zone and getting arrested and killed. Some of you might remember political activist Steve Biko, who was detained and in jail in 1977. And he was killed, and he's one of countless people where initially no response was given, no explanation was given, even for their deaths. And they would just say, you know, unknown, unspecified. Sometimes they would give an answer like he fell down the stairs, or he had a heart attack. And mostly this was just lies, right? So coming back to being a child, jumping now into my teenage years, I remember visiting my cousins in South Africa, in Johannesburg, South Africa, and hearing Johnny Clegg and Savuka, for example, or Miriam Makeba at music festivals. I was too young to go, but I would hear this music and I was oblivious to understand that these were actually revolution songs. And it was only when Johnny Clegg left his body a few years ago that I went back now as an adult, living in America, listening to these lyrics. And Johnny Clegg himself, he was a white guy that was actually sort of called, they called him Impi, which is a Zulu soldier, and he actually learned Zulu dancing, and he was like this honorary Zulu because he stood up for the rights of Black South Africans and used his music as a form of protest. When I got to high school, my first year of high school, I was 13, and that was the first time that we had Black or brown children in my school. The schools had been white only leading up to that. And it was quite shocking, actually. I remember in assembly, we would stand outside in what they called the quad, this open air space, and they would try and do roll call. And African names, the way that African words are created, or at least in isiXhosa. isiXhosa is the language of Nelson Mandela, and is many people speak it in the Cape. And this language, isiXhosa, it kind of gets built how Latin is built, where one word contains like the pronoun and the verb. Those would all be in one word. So these long names that the teachers just couldn't pronounce. And I remember even feeling quite indignant when Black kids would come to school late, or they would miss school or something. I was like, you know, we've opened the schools now, and so why aren't they wanting to get an education? I didn't really have any understanding of what it was like to grow up by candlelight, or to be around all that violence every night. And that was the reality for a lot of my Black peers. So, you know, integration was starting to happen. Nelson Mandela had been released, if I'm remembering correctly, it was in 1992. And as I was still a teenager, I remember they wheeled into our history classroom, but they wheeled one of those big old black TVs in, you know, nobody had smartphones in those days, but into the classroom, and we literally watched Mandela walking out of prison. And that night, he gave a speech in Cape Town, right near where my mom worked. My mom worked in HR, and like literally 5 minutes from her office. And at the time, even though I watched the speech with my mom and my stepdad, I remember my stepdad saying, and again, this was really racist, he said, "Wow, is that really all he can say after 27 years? So I've gone back in the last week and rewatched his speech and rewatched a lot of a lot of the things that I'm highlighting to you in this talk today, Mandela was really quite incredible. There were literally people like hanging off the balcony of where he was speaking, and he was surrounded by people. Somebody just shoved a microphone in his face. But it was really quite remarkable for what lay ahead. And what lay ahead was him and FW De Klerk. So FW De Klerk was the prime minister at the time, that's like the president. And he realized, literally, I think even before he was elected, that things were not working in South Africa. Like, we had the whole world with consumer boycotts. And thank you, Medora, you're doing such a great job offering all these links to people. I appreciate that. But yeah, he knew that once he came to power, apartheid was so failing. The international community was protesting. We had sanctions that I was certainly aware of growing up, because, you know, the international community was trying to get the attention of the apartheid government to bring about this change. And I've ended up living in America and marrying an American who told me, he's quite a lot older, or he was, yeah, he is quite a lot older than I am. So he was at anti-apartheid rallies back in the 70s when he was a student at Cal. So, and then we land up married all these years later. So the sanctions meant quite a few things. It meant that South Africa became quite an independent and very driven society. And there you had this, you know, seeing these shanty towns, even in the affluent suburb I lived in, around the election, shanty towns started happening, and people, they called them squatter camps. People were starting to squat, just like we're seeing in America today. In the Bay Area, we're seeing tent cities. I'm actually shocked, especially now when we are sheltering in place, because I don't see streets as often anymore, particular streets. When I go back, the shift is quite dramatic to see how many more tents there are. And even as we were impacted by what's going on, for example, long before the schools were even integrated, we had regular bomb scares. So in California, the students are all encouraged to learn about earthquake preparedness. And we didn't have earthquakes, but there were bomb scares because the ANC, the African National Congress, had tried for many years. They'd been trying, I think as soon as the law changed in 1913, which the Land Act banned Black people from owning land. The land that they had, you know, their ancestors had lived on. They were banned from doing that as far back as 1913. And after trying everything peacefully, eventually they took up what's called the armed struggle. They had a branch of the ANC called Mkhonto weSizwe. I won't ask you to spell that. I'm not even sure if I could. But literally, I remember, I mean, the white kids even made a joke out of that. I remember during exams one year, we were all led out onto the field because there was a bomb scare. And I'm pretty sure that one of the kids just didn't want to write their exams. But because it was a very real thing, they had to take it seriously and make sure that the children were safe. So part of the protest in South Africa became really complex because, you know, as I mentioned in the Soweto Uprising, and that was 76, I believe, people were starting to boycott the schools. They were forced to learn Afrikaans. Afrikaans is like a very simple version of Dutch. And that was the language of the oppressor. You actually couldn't graduate high school without passing both English and Afrikaans. And they got this blacks got this inferior education. So they burnt the schools, they burnt their textbooks in protest. But this had a huge ripple effect because, then they weren't getting an education. And this is one of the ways that Nelson Mandela really started helping to bring the country together. So he didn't renege the armed struggle right after he was released. The country literally was on the verge of an all-out civil war. And when I was first preparing for this talk, I actually wanted to make the point that South Africa prevented a civil war. And in some ways they did, but as I've watched the videos of the things that I was removed from, like the tanks going into the townships and like police officers, I'm really impressed you found that, Midori, and you spelled Mkhonto where, thank you. As like police officers would just open fire on the public, on Black people for no reason. Like, oh, thank you, I beg your pardon. Thank you, Scott. Thank you to our participant for finding that. But I was actually shocked as an adult to watch how bad things got. And what both Mandela and FW De Klerk did so skillfully is they negotiated and worked together. These unseeming allies, right, had to work together. FW De Klerk realized that apartheid could not continue. It wasn't sustainable. And he, like literally within a few days of being elected, he scrapped the Lands Act and he already started putting things in place for Nelson Mandela to be released from prison. But things weren't magically resolved. I mean, there are people that have been fighting pretty much their whole lives. Racism had been prevalent since 1652 when the Dutch first landed in Cape Town and started colonizing. And through really intense negotiations, Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, Rolihlahla is his Xhosa name, Mandela's Xhosa name, and it means troublemaker. And I love that because he caused a lot of trouble. But John Lewis said, good trouble, right? So sometimes it is necessary. I'm not normally somebody to condone violence. But they expertly crafted this and negotiated the transition where everybody was sitting at the table together, white leaders and Black leaders and everything in between. South Africa is often referred to as the rainbow nation. We now have 11 official languages in the country. And I'm sharing that because that means our constitution is printed in 11 languages. Imagine going to a government department and having to fill out forms and you get your pick of 11 languages. Like there was a way to make it so inclusive, actually was also quite clunky, but there was this big commitment, like everybody needs a seat at the table. And I really want to honor the role of Nelson Mandela specifically, because there was already so much of violence, such a culture of violence in South Africa. And the armed struggle was not just restricted to a few people. Like many guns were taken up and, the apartheid government was blaming the ANC for things that sometimes they were doing themselves. So there was terrorism and counterterrorism, and really, in the end, very few people knew who was actually to blame. But Mandela took all of that energy, and this country literally on the verge of being lost. And he said to the people, right after Chris Hani was a political activist that was murdered, and he said, we have to stop the bloodshed and the violence. We have to do that, otherwise we will lose everything we've been fighting for. And while it certainly was a collaboration between Mandela and FW De Klerk to bring about a peaceful South Africa, had Nelson Mandela not said that to his people, begged his people, and shown up with this incredible leadership, he really, I don't think that would have been possible. Only an iconic figure like Mandela could have done that in the way he did. So, jumping back now to South Africa, where I am a young college student. And at 17, I elected to attend Stellenbosch University, which was a conservative Afrikaans university. And I did that because at the time, again, there was still a lot of protest going on, and students are often very political. And there was so much unrest, and students were striking and throwing trash all over the campuses of many of the universities. So I picked a conservative Afrikaans university so that I would have the least amount of disruption to my education. And it was quite interesting because I majored in French and political science. So in French, obviously they lectured to us in French, but in political science, all my classes were in Afrikaans. And we were studying this transition that had now happened and how the new constitution was written in a way that represented all the people. So when I speak to people about Apartheid South Africa, many of them also reference the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And for those of you that are new to what that is, this was one of the agreements that we had, that people could get amnesty, and this commission went on for many years, for the truth to actually come out to help bring healing and closure, especially for the families of those that had lost loved ones in the struggle. And I was now in my second year of college, the end of my first year of college, when I was literally watching Winnie Mandela, Nelson Mandela's second wife, talking about her involvement and even the violence that she had committed. There's a very famous activist called Stompie. I believe he was 11 years old when he was necklaced. And necklacing in South Africa is it's a really awful practice where tires are put around a person so they can't move their arms, and then it's doused with gasoline and set alight. So, the concept of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the TRC, was very noble, and people were given amnesty from the atrocities that had been committed. And I want to be clear, on both sides of the struggle. But the sad part was that some people were still not willing, like Winnie Mandela, for example, to be totally truthful and honest. So while I often see the TRC praised, and the idea was good, and there was some healing, and there was some closure, like it's actually still happening in South Africa today, where the cases remain unresolved and people are still looking for closure. So after college, I went to London for the first time, and I was able to do that because the British colonized South Africa, and I could get a 1-year work visa there. And then my father also happened to be British, so ultimately I ended up becoming a British citizen. But for the first time in my life, I saw white people doing road work. I had never seen a white person like doing construction, or like it was shocking to me. It was really shocking to me. And things had been so divided, like there were only certain jobs in South Africa that Black people were even allowed to do. So in white neighborhoods, they could come and work as maids, or they could work as gardeners. And that's a very limiting scope, or petrol, they call gasoline petrol in South Africa, petrol attendants. So here I was now in London, and it honestly was really quite confronting. I worked in an office that was integrated. I was working at a government department, and that was very integrated. And yeah, I started waking up. Actually, I remember looking at London going, wow, everybody's cars are parked on the side of the road so openly. People would just street park. And I'd never seen that in South Africa, because by the time I left, people were living, white people at least, were living behind 6-foot white walls with barbed wire and electric fences and you know, having alarm systems with laser beams. And if you're in Johannesburg, you would have guard dogs and maybe a guard at the end of the street. I mean, that's how violent things had become in South Africa. And a big part of why I left was, you know, I actually felt trapped in. You had to have iron bars across the doors and across the windows, and sometimes even gates into different stages of the house, because the value of life, there wasn't much value of life anymore. And armed robberies were commonplace. And coming back to the cars, they still are today, hijacked at an alarming rate. I have dear friends that I grew up with, and even family members that have been held up at gunpoint, like to steal a handbag out of a car, or to hijack the car. So to see these lines and lines of cars overnight, I was like, this is hijacker's paradise. Because in South Africa, we were really having to live kind of on this high state of alert. People often say to me now, living in Oakland, California, like, wow, you live in Oakland, so dangerous there. And, you know, there's an undercurrent of struggle here and of transformation in the Bay Area that I think is very potent. But up until quite recently, I've been feeling very safe. I can walk in the forest on my own and not be worried about getting raped. As a student in South Africa at 17, all of the girls carried mace on us. It's legal in South Africa. And we carried mace because rape, it's still a big problem there, but was happening in broad daylight. The last time I was in South Africa, I was sitting at a coffee shop with friends, and I put my purse on the seat next to me, right next to me. And my friends were all totally aghast. They're like, no, 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 it's not safe there. Someone can come and steal your bag, steal your purse. I don't even have to have that awareness living in America today. But specifically over the last 4 years, I know that things have been changing rapidly in America, but more and more I've been getting concerned about how I'm seeing. It started off as like echoes of apartheid, or things that I was remembering, like the shanty towns and like the tent cities we're seeing that are popping up and expanding literally daily in this country. But I started, you know, the echoes started becoming louder and louder. And once the current occupant of the White House was put into power, I know a lot of Americans, or at least the ones I hung out with, were grieving. And I was living in America, and I was surprised that Trump was voted into power, but I didn't realize the implications of that. I'm shaking just as I'm saying this, because I remember when the borders were closed, even at JFK Airport, and I just watched that the laws, completely irrational laws, just like we had in South Africa, were being implemented, where people who even had the right to live here, who had green cards, were just denied access to getting into the US. And I was on a green card. I'd married an American, but I had no desire to get an American passport. I already had a South African and a British. Again, noticing my privilege there. I had options to leave South Africa. But now I started getting really worried. I was like, people with green cards, it gives you a right to work in the United States, but it doesn't actually give you or guarantee that at the border you will be allowed in. So you can literally be denied access at any time. And I now have a son who is very American, who has a baseball cap and loves his baseball and was even into NASCAR for a while. You know, he really is embracing some of the American cultures and values here. And as I became more and more concerned about this gradual shift, imagine the heat being turned up on the water to allow it to boil. That's my experience of what's happening in America today. And I honestly have not paid that much attention to the news, quite intentionally, until 6 months ago, when for me it became imperative due to the pandemic to literally be up to date with what was happening. And I know there's a tendency for people to just tune out. It's easier to do that in many ways, to just tune out and not pay attention to what is happening. But I decided to naturalize as an American last year because I wanted to have rights in this country that couldn't be taken away. And I wanted the opportunity in this election to cast my vote and have my voice matter. Because in 2016, I thought it didn't matter if I didn't vote. And after the vote came in and I started realizing what was happening and the freedoms that are being corroded really fast, I jumped through a lot of hoops so that I can cast my vote. For me, it is really shocking that according to World Population Review, which you can find at worldpopulationreview.com, the US has actually surpassed South Africa as a more dangerous country in our world today in 2020. I want to be clear that countries like Honduras, Brazil, Uganda, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, I know a lot of those are in in Africa, and Kuwait, that'll make it very relevant for Americans. Those all come after America and then after South Africa. US is ranked 36th as the 36th dangerous country in the world. South Africa is follows right up after them. I'm noticing this trend of more and more people taking up arms in their own ways. And I hear more sirens in America today than I've actually heard anywhere in the world. And I've lived all over the world because I went looking for a new home. I have become increasingly concerned that South Africa is on the verge of civil war, which is quite a dramatic thing to say, but the same signs are there, the same freedoms are being taken away from people. And when Trump got on the news recently and said that Mandela lacked leadership, I couldn't remain silent anymore. So I've done my best to be sharing, from my personal experience, because there's much even growing up in both of these environments, I don't understand. But I wanted people to be aware of what is at risk. We all matter. And I really invite you to vote. literally as if your life depends on it. We know that Ruth Bader Ginsburg unfortunately passed away yesterday. And that again has put our court system in the US, the Supreme Court, in a much more precarious position. Her dying wish, literally, is that the next president is the one that will appoint the next Supreme Court justice. But I wanted to offer this wake-up call to those of us that are, hanging out on Instagram or filling in the latest meme, who are burnt out on the news. The stakes are really high. South Africa, again, violence is continuing to erupt, and without Mandela's leadership, things are also getting more precarious there again. We have somebody in power now that is inciting violence in this country. And we really need to wake up and notice that the consequences, thank you, Midori, the consequences could be really dire if we don't take this seriously. The election is coming up November 3rd, and please vote. I'm not even going to tell you what to vote, but I hope that the stories that I've shared have landed as some kind of a cautionary tale so that we cannot repeat the same mistakes of the past. And this is why I now have a 13-year-old son. His favorite subject is history, and that gives me hope, because if we don't learn from the history of the past, and thank you, I appreciate that, Midori, you've put the link in here to check if you're registered to vote. Do check and double check and triple check again so that you can make sure that your voice is heard and that the unjust things that happened in South Africa are not allowed to happen in this country anymore. So I've been talking for a long time. Thank you for listening. Thank you so much. I'm seeing some people applauding, and this was one of the edgiest videos I think I've ever done. So thank you. We did promise that we would open this up for some questions, and I do want to, thank you so much. Thank you. People are offering generous comments. But if you have questions, we want to make some time now. So please put them in the chat message. I'm not going to call on people, both for confidentiality and also I want to make sure I'm able to answer the questions. Let me read this first one. Oh, yes, that's a great question. What lessons from South Africa's experience of dismantling the system of apartheid resonate most for you as you look at the divisions and upheaval in America today? So there is competition over power and over land all over the world. People seem to fight about that a lot. I think nationalism, while it's good to have pride in your country, when it becomes this nationalistic agenda, can actually be very, very dangerous. But what I'm wanting to highlight with this talk was the biggest difference. The biggest difference was that we had two people in FW De Klerk and Mandela, Nelson Mandela, who were committed to finding a peaceful resolution to this. And Mandela, the iconic figure that he is beloved now by almost all people in South Africa. Doesn't matter their race or even what they voted back in the day. He is revered and considered a treasure. So they were committed to a peaceful way of moving forward as they were dismantling the system of apartheid. And the part that deeply concerns me today is we have people in power right now in America that are deeply committed to upheaval, that are excusing, people based on race. Kids are allowed to walk around with rifles, armed rifles, and murder people and get away with it. Police are murdering people left, right, and center. And they're just getting off with like a slap on the wrist. That is not somebody who is committed to peace. That is not somebody who can skillfully, it took so much skill and work and patience and negotiation and commitment to the process just to make sure things didn't get worse in South Africa. So I'm inviting you to go and look. There's so much. We are so blessed today. You can look on YouTube. There's tons of information. On Amazon, you can watch, not that I want to be promoting Amazon, but you can watch a movie called Mandela, Long Walk to Freedom, which is based on his book. His book is understandably about this thick, so I remember trying to read it as a child and it was very intimidating. But you can literally go and watch a movie for 90 minutes and learn so much from the history. And the divisions are only going to come when we start listening to each other and trying to understand. I remember sitting in, right after the 2016 election results came in, I had a meeting with some colleagues, and Midori was actually there. And as people were sharing their grief about and their shock from the results of the 2016 election, I was noticing even in the vocabulary, it was becoming an us and a them. And I paused our conversation and I said, we have to be very, very careful about othering people. Because when we do that, it creates this polarity. It creates this split between people. And it becomes an us against them. That is not the way we're going to heal America. And I know things are heating up. This is kind of a long answer because you've asked a big question, but things are heating up even on social media. Like I'm just posting things that I think are relevant and we can't even hear each other anymore as people are commenting, and it's getting so divisive. And this is exactly what the current regime wants. So my invitation is for us to start listening. Mandela was an excellent listener. Start listening. Try and find compassion. Not that you have to agree with people's, perspective or point of view, but give them a place to have their say. Because if we all in this world of cancel culture and blocking people, the minute they have a contrasting view to us, how do we begin to understand each other? And in a very relevant way, I want to speak to something in my family in America. My mother-in-law met her husband at a Republican convention. That's how Republican she is. I know she certainly voted Trump into power in 2016, and I imagine she's likely going to vote for him again. She is not a bad person. She is a wonderful grandma, and she's kind of been like the mother I always wished I'd had, aside from her politics. But, I don't agree with her politics, and that doesn't make her a bad person. So let's create spaces where we can actually hear each other and work towards really speaking the truth. There's all this fake news. Anytime the truth is spoken, it seems that Trump declares it fake news. The evidence is there and it is mounting. So pay attention to what is there and listen to your neighbors and your friends and have a dropped-in heart conversation, because otherwise we are doomed. We are doomed today. Sorry, that's like dramatic, but that's how strong it feels. Okay, next question. Do you see the, whoopsie daisy, that just scroll down. Do you see the potential in some kind of truth and reconciliation process here in America? Wow. I honestly am a little conflicted about the process in South Africa with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I think it helped, and I'm a big proponent of truth and the truth being spoken, even when it's inconvenient or even mildly uncomfortable. Often it's very uncomfortable, to speak the truth. I think it would be helpful if we tried. It's certainly a way to try and listen, but I don't think that's the only answer. So I hope that answers your question. Dory, thank you for adding in all these ways people can sign up to, help staff the polling stations. And then there's a question, do you think racism is changing today in South Africa? Is it getting better or worse, or appearing in a different form? That's a really great question. Thank you. When Zuma was president in South Africa, he was very problematic. There was a lot of corruption. And South Africa, and this was just in the last few years, went back to how bad things were, even though we now had a Black government. The police force were acting like the police force during apartheid. And I saw something I had never seen before. I saw a video of protests happening against Zuma to get him ousted as president. And white people and colored people. Colored people in South Africa are like Trevor Noah, who is mixed race, a parent that comes from different nationalities, which, by the way, was illegal. It was illegal even to have sex with somebody that wasn't in your race under apartheid South Africa. How insane is that? So that's why Trevor Noah's book, Born a Crime, he literally was not allowed to exist. His entire existence was illegal. Anyway, coming back to your question. I was so encouraged to see white South Africans are not as good at toying, this dancing. There's a very funny skit that Trevor Noah did. I think I actually posted it for my patrons this week. If not, I'll go back and post it for you all. But where he said, white protesters, they're so lazy, nothing will happen. So the toying is a dancing, but it's dynamic and it moves forward, right? And here were whites and coloreds and blacks all protesting together. My general sense in the years, I left South Africa many years ago now, in 1989, 1999, I think. And by now, democracy was well established and people were, for the most part, so tired of fighting about race that they just carry on. They started carrying on with their lives. We weren't in the same struggle anymore. But again, as all politicians do, a lot of completely unrealistic proposals were shared by the ANC in the lead up to the founding election in 1994, where they said, everybody will have free schooling and free housing within a year. The South African government was bankrupt in a year. And that created very unrealistic expectations. South Africa is also, sorry, let me just take a moment because I looked at the comments and it distracted me for a second. Unless one is continually committed to focusing on peace and reconciliation, I think there has to be a continual focus on that for things to keep getting better. So I think it was Lord Acton who said, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think I'm butchering that. But anyway, the more power people have, the more likely there is to be corruption. And while South Africa definitely has gotten better in terms of rights for the people, racism there is so linked to the economic divide that apartheid created. And, again, when I lived in London, I suddenly met a big middle class. There isn't that in South Africa. There's a huge, very wealthy upper class, which used to be white and is now not only white, and then a huge, not lower class, but a huge poor class who are living on virtually nothing. So when that happens, and when there has been such a culture of violence in the country, and people literally will shoot you to take your car, or I know South Africans are going to be really mad I'm focusing on the violence, but it's also true. You know, people are told if somebody breaks into your house and is carrying out an armed robbery, keep sleeping, keep pretending you are sleeping so that you save your life. When you are living amongst that, and reparations have not been made, and you know, much has been done, but there is so much work to do. And from I wouldn't say that racism is as prevalent in South Africa today, because in general, people are just getting on with their lives. They've been fighting for hundreds of years. But the problem, if I contrast it to America, is that racism has for the most part been quite subversive here. And that has been scary. I know it depends on your perspective, but a lot of white people in America, until quite recently, have not been dramatically impacted, right? I remember arriving here and watching a documentary, I believe it was from the 80s, about the violence against the Latinx community in LA in the 80s. And I was shocked. I was like, but I'm in America. America to me was the bastion of democracy. And yet it's not. Yet there's horrific racism happening. And when a white South African that grew up under the apartheid regime notices how racist something is, like, we really have to be paying attention to that. So I think this is a complicated issue. South Africa is more complicated because economically things are still divided there. Thank you, I am tracking time. I think things are definitely better, and I think there are still a lot of frustrations in South Africa today. And in that country, I do believe there are enough people that are wanting South Africa to survive as a thriving, successful nation. And what's concerning me in America is we seem to be in this continuous backsliding down. I think the United Nations was here looking at our homeless population just a few years ago, issuing a report saying that America now is like living in a third world country. We need to pay attention to those signs today. So I want to comment, somebody said, referenced a movie called Social Dilemma, making it difficult to sort out true from fake news. And while it is, I highly recommend watching that movie for sure to gain some perspective. But this is the very reason why I'm saying we need to listen to voices so that we're not in an echo chamber, and make friends with people that have different views to us. But there are websites, Snopes, I think there's a Politico, I don't want to quote it wrong. There are websites where you can actually check whether the facts that are being presented to you are true or not. Midori is WAPO, is that white people, or what is, I don't know what that means. The Washington Post. Thank you. I didn't get the jargon. Yes, so it doesn't actually take that long. Sometimes it only takes a second or two. And when I have people debating, because I wasn't even posting anything political for a while, and now I feel it's too important not to. So I ask people to quote their sources when they are offering a view. Maybe they do know something I don't know. But often it can just be a rhetoric that's been fed. We forget we are all fed rhetorics. So do go and check the facts. That actually is possible. There we go. Midori saying the Washington Post fact checker. Thank you for that resource. So we are going to be winding up soon. So I want to give an opportunity, if you still have questions, to pop them in the chat so that I can do my best to get to them. Thank you. I appreciate, Midori, that you're sharing these links about, I beg your pardon, it's one of our, it's one of the listeners pointing out links to the articles about the extreme poverty that the UN special report found. And yeah, we need to look at that very seriously, because I think as we live in the country, most people aren't realizing how fast our democracy is being eroded. What I'm noticing in the last few months is, because the news in the US is as intense as it is very hard to keep up on everything that is shifting and changing. And sometimes even the headlines are the ones distracting us from what the current administration is trying to do and the rights and freedoms it's removing. So using community as a way to help you learn about all this news. We can't all possibly remember everything, but I notice as I stay in conversation and actual connection with people, we can learn in community together. I love this question. We have one user that's so engaged, and I'm really appreciating that. Thank you. Question is, in the midst of all of this, what gives you hope? In many ways, the protests that have been happening around Black Lives Matter, they've been happening ever since I've lived in, well, pretty much ever since I've lived in Oakland. But this year, I've seen a huge shift in the protests. My son lives with his dad half-time in Piedmont, which is a very mostly white, affluent neighborhood, and we have him there to go to the schools are very good. And I saw, even for a month during the height of the protests, for the first time in 15 years, I saw white Piedmont residents who don't normally protest. These are people that work at the SEC and fund managers and lawyers, right? They were out on the streets with signs joining the Black Lives Matter movement, saying, enough, we have to change. And this is part of what gives me hope. I feel like finally we are waking up, and it is way overdue for many people, including me, like waking up. I went to my first protest the other day. I was always too nervous to protest because I didn't want to be, I wanted to say evicted, but I mean like banished from this country. I didn't want to be sent away because I didn't have rights. And now that I have rights, I'm like, it's too much. We have to speak up. So it gives me hope that the conversation has gone, is happening on a national level. People like Brene Brown, who has a huge following as a white woman in this country, is saying enough, like we have to make change. And we can't always have it on the backs of Black folks in this country. You know, when the protests were happening so vehemently after George IV was murdered, everybody was posting on social media, right? It was like the cool hashtag to have to like support Black Lives Matter. But that struggle has not finished. We have to stay just as vigilant and just as engaged. Many Black people have still been killed since George Floyd, despite the police reforms. So I'm probably preaching to the choir here. I don't want to make this too challenging for you. But have hope, because your vote does matter. Your voice does matter. Nelson Mandela, in the beginning, people had invited him. He was a very good lawyer in Johannesburg, standing up for Black people. And he's like, I'm doing enough. I'm saving Black people in court. So I don't have time to get involved with the ANC. Like, I'm not political. And when the pass laws were passed in South Africa, a boss pass, which is like the pass that your boss has given you so that you can work in a certain area. You had to have papers. Black people had to have papers on them all the time to prove that they were allowed to be where they were. And they would get thrown in jail for not having their passes. So there was a strike on the buses in South Africa. Like, I'm actually shocked at how little people protest in America compared to Europe and compared to South Africa. It is our right to protest here. So they did these big protests and boycotted the buses, which was the main means of transport in those days. And Mandela saw the oppression that was happening. He was watching his friends getting killed, and he was like, how can I not get involved? And again, that is part of why I'm sharing this today, because we all need to be involved in whichever way makes us feel comfortable. For some of that is staffing a polling station. For me, it was going to a life over rent protest the other day. You know, I was like a little virgin going in there going, am I going to get tear gassed? And there were only like 125 of us, and like the police didn't even show up. But, you know, there are ways, just like I'm sharing some of my stories today to talk about what it was like growing up in an institutionally oppressive system in South Africa. And I'm also doing my work, like my anti-racism work. I have so much I have to do growing up in apartheid South Africa, and my father was British. When I was in India last year, I literally was seeing in Kolkata like British monuments that were monuments to the oppression of the Indian people. This is a worldwide problem. This is not even just an American problem. And we've got to start seeing each other as human. And in my work, that's a lot of what I do. I invite people to look in each other's eyes and see the divine and see the beloved in that person. And we can do that. One of the teachers that I follow is a guru called Neem Karoli Baba, and he was the guru to Steve Jobs and to Ram Dass and Krishna Das, for those of you who know. Anyway, to many, many well-known people. And some of his whole teaching was to love everybody. And Ram Dass, for many years, whoever the sitting president was, he would have them up on his altar. And I know for Ram Dass, Trump was a hard one. He's like, I have to love everybody, right? So how can we catalyze and use this change to make meaningful shifts in this country so we can get more aligned with loving the people that are around us, our friends, our neighbors, our family members. I have talked a little bit of politics with my mother-in-law, but I still show up loving her. I still show up loving her despite her views. So let's keep those conversations open. I'm going to stop because I know Midori will be like 3 minutes to go. Yes. So do confirm that you're registered to vote. You can, in many states, I know in California for sure, you can request mail-in balloting. I've been mailing in my ballot for years. There's nothing insecure about it. So please do that. I'm going to be continuing to add resources to my Patreon page for people. Yes, and as Midori is saying, if you're worried about the pandemic, which we should all be, in my opinion, like, vote by mail. There's no lines, there's no contamination. So, I'm going to pause just there again. Thank you for dropping in the link for Neem Karoli Baba. So I haven't let you get a word in, Midori, because literally I could have, for years I avoided this conversation actually. People would be like, so tell me about South Africa. It's just too important not to talk about the lessons we can learn.
You nailed it. You shared from your heart, you shared from your experience, and yeah, this is, I want to thank you for doing this and tapping me to as a as a host for this. And yeah, really, really beautifully organized. This meeting will be available as a recording in each of our Patreons. It is really important, and I would even encourage you, my dear, that we put this out to not just our subscribers.
Yes, in time, and I want to make sure we honor our patrons first for doing that, because some people I know couldn't be on the call today. But yes, I do think this. I'm glad to hear that you think this should be shared widely, because I do. I offer this, and thank you. I'm seeing comments of support in comments.
I will actually also say you might want to think about making this into a TEDx talk.
Wow. Oh. Thank you. Woo. Thank you. There's certainly enough material to do that. I would require some training, but
can I make a request?
Yes.
Would you take a nice big deep breath and whatever it is, your woo thing that you do right now?
My woo thing?
Yeah, just to you done good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One of the people that joined the call said that she missed the beginning. So that's part of why we're making the recording available. I'm going to make it available as soon as I get the link from Midori to my inner circle patrons, but I believe Midori is sharing it with everybody. And in time, it'll be shared with, much more widely.
Yeah, I'll be posting it to all of my active subscribers. So that'll be there. I need to do a little bit of editing. I want to do an official end for the recording, and then we can keep talking a little bit, okay? So I want to thank you for your bravery. I mean, this I know wasn't easy for you. I also come from Japan, where it is so profoundly racist that Japanese people have no idea that they're actually racist, both structurally and legally, deeply racist. But it's a slightly different expression of that because it has not erupted in fire and death and violence. What it is happening in Japan instead of an outward explosion of rage and grief, it becomes inward. So thus the high suicide rate. So what appears to be a polite, calm, nice society, and now mind you, go visit Japan, it's beautiful, the foods are lovely, it's fantastic as a tourist, please show up because it's lovely there to visit. But it is a kind of nefarious racism. There's the outward explosive rage, and then there's the internalized rage, where people essentially quietly die. And that there's this Japanese saying, shoganai, which means what can you do? It is significantly less active than an oi, because an oi is a kvetch followed by an action. But a shoganai is, what can you do? You just shut up and persevere. So what appears on the surface as a harmonious culture is actually based upon absolutely giving up that one has no choice. So here we have a choice for action. Someday I'll get to talk about my thing and what I observe in Japan. But today it is about what you saw, what you feel, what you're concerned about, and the actions that we as citizens of the world can take and make things better. So on that note, I want to thank all of you viewers.
Well, I want to share this, Midori. Just like Mandela thought, I don't have time for this. I can't make a change. He literally changed the course of the entire country. One man. Mm-hmm. So you do matter. Your choices do matter. And thank you all so much for being here today.